Welcome back. I'm Roy Gerstenberger of First Person Services, and this is DeLovely, a podcast featuring conversations with people who are creative, curious, and committed to building whole communities where inclusion and diversity is celebrated. How would you like to have the opportunity to sit down with the Commissioner for Disability, Aging, and Independent Living Services in your state and find out what makes them tick? What's on their mind about plans for the future of the system? And how are they navigating the space between federal requirements, service agencies, legislative accountability, and people who are getting support? Well, I recently had a chance to do that with Commissioner Monica Hutt for the state of Vermont. Please join me and listen in. We'll talk about payment reform, the state community of practice on cultural and linguistic competence that embraces the issues of new Americans, LGBTQ, poverty, and ableism, as well as support for the right of people to choose and be supported in using the communication system of their choice. Monica is at the top of her field in state government in her positive, progressive values and the integration of those with inclusion and diversity and smart administration. So join us.
Thank you very much, Monica, for being our guest today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know that people are very appreciative of your leadership of the system in Vermont and recognize all of the hard work that goes in at the Dale team here.
Yes.
And there has been some tremendous accomplishments in 2019. With the new year, it's an opportunity to reflect back and, from your perspective, explore what you feel were, let's say, the top 3 accomplishments. There's been so many things that have happened, but what would you put at the top tier there in terms of what you're proud of in our evolving system?
I think at some level I divide that a little bit into the mechanical, practical, and then the more aspirational, because I think we have some things that we're working on that are powerful and really important in a philosophical way.
Yes.
And then I think that there are things that we've just, there's the day-to-day work that has to keep happening. And I think that we're making progress there as well. So when I think of that day-to-day work, we're working really hard on this idea of payment reform in the developmental services system. And that's very anxiety provoking. It's a little scary. It's big, it's interesting, it's exciting, it's nerve-wracking, all of those emotions wrapped up into one thing. But it is really an opportunity for us to, I really believe this, to position this system, our developmental services in Vermont, so that they are sustainable into the future, to really get ourselves on solid ground in terms of the information we collect, the rates that we use, the transparency and accountability in that system to families and to individuals for services that are being provided, and a way to really build developmental services into this bigger conversation around payment reform in the state of Vermont, so that we're not left behind or left out of that, but are really front and center. And for all of that, it is still very much a mechanical, practical kind of work. It's taking a lot of time, but I'm happy about that. I'm happy about the work that we're doing to strengthen the system. I'm happy about the fact that we've been able to engage stakeholders as much as we have, even though we can always do more and better with that. And I think we're learning even now about how to do that and how to rely on our partners to help us with that.
Which has always been a strength anyway of Vermont system, the engagement of having people at the table.
I think it is. And I think that sometimes we hold ourselves to an incredibly high standard. And so we know that we're not meeting that 100% standard. And so we're always a little frustrated with ourselves. I think people are always a little frustrated with us. Of course, we could do it better. One of the things that we did over this last year, which took almost a year and a half or 2 years, was to finally dedicate a full-time position to payment reform. So Claire McFadden, who's been such an advocate and such a strength in this system, is shifting over to focus 100% on that and to be able to really pay even more attention to the stakeholder engagement. And we are replacing her as the DD director. So that's another big accomplishment for 2019.
Yes, that restructuring, would you say?
I don't think it's not so much a restructuring of the service, the DDSD division, but I think it's adding Claire's expertise and backfilling that, which we tend not to do in state government. There's a lot of shifting people around, but not a lot of replacing. So I'm pleased that we've essentially added that resource, which I think is hugely helpful.
This is a perhaps naive question, but why payment reform now? Why is that happening now? There are similar types of actions in other states, but also payment reform is a unique characteristic of the Vermont system as a whole.
It is.
Explore that?
Absolutely. And I've said this many times to many different people. I think that what we recognized in Vermont was that we had grown so quickly from a very strong beginning with the closure of the Brandon Training School, right? Which I almost don't even want to reference anymore because it was so long ago. But nevertheless, it was the catalyst for this system to really develop as a community-based system. And that system grew so quickly and expanded to include all of our partners, all of our designated agencies and our specialized service agencies. And we didn't keep pace with the kind of the systems that we needed to maintain accountability and transparency, to make sure that we were up to date in our ability to assess people's needs, to make sure that those needs translated to services, to make sure that those services connected to payments. That all sounds very, it's not very sexy. You know, none of it is very exciting. And yet that's the part of a system that creates sustainability and stability into the future. And in recognizing that we had some pretty big gaps, both on the part of the state and in the part of our providers, you know, that we both had some gaps that hadn't been filled and some systems that were really antiquated and were not keeping up and keeping pace with the growth in developmental services and the explosion of opportunities for people. When you have that big a gap and it shows up, and it shows up to lawmakers and legislators and administrators and funders, you look less stable and less strong than we wanted to be. So as we continue to talk to Vermonters about the importance of funding developmental services, of maintaining the quality that we have, of building people's lives in the way that we want to build them, we can't talk about that if we are not equally strong on the mechanical components of a sustainable system. So I think that there was a confluence of that, a recognition of those gaps and those areas of weakness, and a recognition that we wanted to shore those up so that we could walk into the future clean and clear with a really stable structure for people to look at, to really filling all the chinks so that we didn't have to worry about those, so that we could just move forward and worry about how do we build a system that supports people to live as they want to live.
Interesting. What strikes me about how you characterize that is that a lot of what you're talking about, you use the term stability, stabilization, and preserving the strengths of what we have. Whereas where other states are doing payment reform, they're trying to catch up to how do we create a community-based system?
Right.
Because, you know, we have all of these structures, and now the federal government is asking us to move away from special settings and isolation and congregate. And so they're trying to prepare for that, whereas you're in this position of appreciating the strengths and, as you say, stabilizing, which is a unique challenge for a state director.
I think it is.
Your colleagues are in a different position.
I think that that's true. And it's interesting because I think that what you just said, Roy, is so important, because from a federal perspective, they tend to legislate based on systems that are not where we are. And so sometimes we find this is very true in all of the conversations around conflict-free case management and the new federal regulations around home and community-based services. I think that the federal government was legislating to the lowest common denominator in terms of community-based system. And because our system has evolved so far past that, some of the rules almost feel as if they're pulling us a little backwards. And so having to strategize around that and to interpret them in a way that makes sense for Vermont and to articulate our differences to the federal government, that's a challenge, I think, for 2020, certainly. And now we're mixing and matching a little bit of accomplishments and looking forward. But I think in 2020, part of our conversation is how do we address that in a way that meets the spirit of the intent of the federal government without artificially creating structures or restructuring in a way that isn't really helpful for us. That's a big challenge, I think.
That's an interesting insight, because it does make, as you say, the federal government is looking at those states where multi-million-dollar corporations are invested in institutional settings, and they don't want that conflict to be embedded in what are the opportunities that can occur in the community.
Absolutely.
We don't have that large corporate type of influence.
We don't. And it's interesting for me to remember, because sometimes I forget this, that home and community-based services and those home and community-based dollars that flow from the federal government really cannot be used in any other way than home and community-based. And so they're trying to build guardrails around the use of those dollars such that they are supporting inclusive, vibrant communities and community living for individuals with developmental disabilities. And we forget that because that's embedded in how we do our work. And so having to remember that the federal government is trying to be cautious around that, we have to rethink how we talk about it, because it isn't enough for us to say, well, of course we believe that. Of course we're doing that. They want proof. They want the guardrails in place. So we have to rethink it a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's one major accomplishment from this last year. Another that you're proud of?
I think
at Dale?
so. I know that we spent some time over the last couple of years working with our community partners in a couple of think tank kind of sessions to really try to imagine where we should be spending time and energy. And there are so many things that came out of that and so many questions that are still to be answered. But one of the pieces that I think we've been working in conjunction with the partners around, with our community-based partners, our designated agencies and specialized service agencies, is really trying to develop some strategies and some solutions for hiring, training, retention of the workforce that we need to continue to maintain our system. So that, I think, has been something that's been really important. Additionally, and I'm going to just flip a page because I get the name wrong every time, the Vermont Community of Practice on Cultural and Linguistic Competence and Developmental Disabilities has been just a huge, powerful piece of work, I think. And I was talking with Amy back and forth a little bit in email yesterday, because I was just asking her to reflect for me, so who does that mean and what does that mean? And certainly there are new Americans coming into the state, not as much as before, but we've got a couple of areas, Rutland and Burlington in particular, that are welcoming in individuals from different countries. And so there's truly cultural differences there. And some of those populations are coming with family members who really do have developmental disability or even traumatic brain injury, some real barriers for them.
Certainly trauma.
Absolutely. So that's certainly one of the cultural pieces. But I think Amy even expanded it a little bit further and talked about LGBTQ as a culture. We talked a little bit about race and gender, and she was talking about each of the persons and people that are represented on that learning collaborative represent kind of different interests. So culture is diverse as I said, literally cultural or gender or race differences, but also LGBTQ, the culture of poverty that can exist in the state of Vermont, certainly ableism and discrimination when we're thinking about those. I tend to always want to insert ageism, because I think although that's not specific to the disability population, that is certainly something that is prevalent and impacting the disability population. I was asking her a little bit about deaf culture, which is something that I'm really interested in, and that hasn't been as much of a conversation. But I think really what's unique about Vermont is not only are we taking on and thinking about those cultural and linguistic differences, but we are really broad in thinking about what that means. It isn't as simple or as specific as just another culture, but all of those subcultures that exist across the state. So I think we're being really creative about that, which is exciting.
It is exciting, for
It
sure.
is kind of really exciting, yeah. Even thinking about, we've got not a huge proportion, but we've got a Native American culture, and the Abenaki culture here in the state of Vermont. So considering that as well. Yeah. I think a couple of other things too that are unique about Vermont. I do think that although we've we've done it in a number of different ways. This idea of person-centered planning, person-centered thinking, which, you were doing a lot of work with when you were with us here at the state and continue to do that work. That is so much a core, and we're not always perfect, and it's not always as structured as it needs to be. And again, you can always do better. That's just sort of my caveat for everything. But I think when you think about person-centered, the cultural differences become part of that planning, right? It doesn't have to be structured so that you're creating a checklist in your head and thinking about the cultural differences. What do I need to do here? But more, let's think about the person, what they tell me, what I need to know, and then what I structure around that. So I think that really makes a difference. The other thing that I am really proud of, Vermont has had a lot of support and success in really supporting communication for individuals, and not losing ground. And I would say I'm really proud of our ability to have stood our ground over the last couple of years. There is a cycle of challenge around that, and that continues to happen, year after year. And year after year, I feel like we have been really successful in not only creating support within Vermont at every level, at the administrative level, with the secretaries that have been here in the agency, with our agencies and their executive directors. It's always a really big challenge in conversation, I think, when we talk about particularly typing or supported typing or facilitated communication. People really struggle with it at so many levels. And yet Vermont has continued to say, we're open to improvement, we're open to tighter structures for how this happens, but we are never willing to deny people the opportunity to communicate in the way that's most effective for them. And so I feel like we've maintained those ideals of a strong system and a strong set of guidelines so that we do it the best way that we can, but we haven't given up and we haven't let anybody lose that. And that's huge for me.
I agree. It's great to hear that the state is really it's wonderful to hear that at the level of Dale, the Department of Aging and Independent Living, that you're willing to champion that and continue to celebrate that.
Yeah.
So well worth celebrating that for 2019.
Definitely.
Sure.
And into 2020.
And into 2020.
And into 2020.
So in looking at ahead.
Yeah. So again, there are those mechanical pieces. So I think really continuing to move forward on the payment reform work. I think that the conflict-free case management those are the mechanical things that we're going to continue to work with. I think that as we look forward, it's the same conversations that we've been trying to have all along, which is how do we continue to imagine with individuals what their lives are supposed to be like, what they want them to be like, and how we help to get them there. I've been really proud of the fact that we've been able to focus so much on post-secondary education. I mean, it's not something that I could have ever imagined 20 years ago that I would be having conversations about. And yet here we are having these vibrant conversations about individuals with disabilities, part of vibrant post-secondary ed programs at some of our local colleges, at UVM, at Castleton State, at all of the Vermont universities. We have some small programs that are happening, and imagining what it is like for parents to see their kids moving through education in that way. The gap that continues to exist, I think, for individuals with developmental disabilities is the ability to live as independently as they might want. I think apartments and housing in Vermont are just really a struggle for everybody. We have an incredibly low rate of available housing and housing stock. And so it's hard for people to get into their own homes, into apartments. I think we need to keep thinking and working on that, because that to me is easily the next frontier, in a way where people are really living in their own communities the way that they want to be. So those pieces I think are out there and are big for next year. I think that might be what's in my head right this minute.
Okay. Great. It's an exciting time to be involved in the system, and it's exciting to have a person with your leadership and vision guiding the system. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we can catch up. Maybe we can make this an annual thing.
I would love that.
Look back and look forward.
I would love that.
Find out more about the DeLovely podcast, including a page specifically dedicated to this episode and our guest today, with some extra credit information about the various topics that we covered. You'll find it at our website at First Person Services. I think you'll really like it. Also, DeLovely is sponsored by listeners like you. Pitch in to keep this podcast going strong, highlighting people who are supporting whole communities. Find us at patreon.com/delovely. Some levels of support can get you a regular guest feature and some digital audio support to your organization. Take a look today. And thank you.